It's time to officially start talking about some 2025 books. Now, I wasn't first on the library hold for this book, and in fact, none of my 2025 library holds have yet come in, though I am eagerly watching my holds and my in-transit books because I have some that I am very much looking forward to in transit and or I am high on the list for. So how am I reviewing a book that I wasn't even first on the list for before any of these others that have come in? I happen to see that The Starlight Heir by Amalie Howard is on Kindle Unlimited, despite the fact that it just came out in January. Now, I am still new to poking around Kindle Unlimited, and I'm playing with it as another way to support authors, so I am by no means an expert, and this may be Avon, since this is a romantasy out of Avon, who I personally, as a romance reader and an Avon lover, don't consider a romantasy forward publisher. It may be a way to bring in more readers, and it worked in the sense that it brought in this reader. Now, to be fair, I did have a library hold on it that I canceled when I got this copy so that I could use that hold on something else. Listen, the library hold game is very strategic, and if you were in Chicago, the minute one of those books goes in transit, you have opened up another hold again. So if you didn't know that, now you know. I'm giving away all my secrets. So let's go ahead and talk about The Starlight Heir by Amalie Howard. But before we jump all the way in, hi, my name is Melody. Whether you've been here before or not, I am happy that you are hanging out now. We talk about books and book adjacent things over here, and ideally on every Friday we dive deeper into a specific book like we are about to do right now. So if that sounds of interest to you, I would love for you to hang out more. Go ahead and subscribe if you are not yet subscribed and feel so inclined, and or like and comment as you feel so led. So with this, let's go ahead and dive into this book. Now, we know that romantasy has really taken off in the last couple of years, and as a lifelong both fantasy reader and romance reader, and a fantasy reader that really enjoys romantic subplots and elements in my fantasy, this seems perfectly primed for me. However, it has also kind of jumbled a lot of the conventions I know in both genres, and I'm feeling a little Goldilocks about it in some ways, but we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. First, let's go ahead and just introduce the world of this book. We start and we are in the singular first person point of view of our lead Soraya, who is a bladesmith in her home village as well as works in her father's tavern. Her mother has passed away, but she is close with her aunt, and there is this idea that maybe there is a kind of attraction between her father and her aunt that is very rarely mentioned, but I feel very invested in for some reason. And we start the book with her getting an invitation to the palace to be introduced to the prince. Very The Princess Throwing a Ball, in a way that I think that if you liked the selection books, you may enjoy this, or this may be a grown-up version of that in some ways. But at first, Soraya thinks this invitation is just a joke, and so she ignores it until her best friend kind of comes over for a visit and a gossip sesh and mentions some other girls in the village having gotten this invitation. Though notably Soraya's nemesis, who honestly I don't think we get enough time with that dynamic, does not get this invitation. So we've got this established right away. And so what seems like it should be a very cut and dry, like, yes, we are going to the palace and we are entering this kind of show competition thing to get the prince's attention, because this is with the intent of finding a bride. That seems like very cut and dry in terms of changing fortunes in whatever way. And Soraya is interested in this, but more from the angle of like getting out of her small town and seeing a little bit more of the world and the capital city than necessarily being interested in the prince, despite the fact that her best friend has made it very clear that she is perpetually single. And so they go to kind of inform her father and her aunt about this invitation, and there is some reticence there that they being Soraya, weren't anticipating or wasn't anticipating, and eventually they do agree that she should go. And so she goes. She does not make a great first impression with the queen, who is notably pretty cold because she ends up kind of like crossing her path, chasing down a headdress that has blown off. And because of gaining this disfavorable attention from the queen, a lot of the other young women who have been brought in from all of these other houses, it's a kind of stratified society in the way that a lot of fantasies of this nature are stratified, and there is like an introduction to that in the front of the book. But honestly, I don't know that it really matters, and I also don't know that the book itself really gives us a great sense of that beyond, like these are the warriors and these are the people that like books and the kind of general gist. It wasn't something that was completely revolutionary to me, nor did I feel like it was really that important. Anyway, so she has kind of like blown her shot to make friends in this foreign place. And she's also kind of gained the attention of an attractive man who finds her situation kind of humorous. And there is some verbal sparring there, especially because she assumes that he's kind of a wayward servant, just kind of taking glee in her misfortune. And so they are on the same kind of level there. And of course, she finds out that is not the case. And so she does end up making one friend. They meet the prince and the king and queen in kind of like a presentation style. The prince is a very cold figure. We get the sense of bad vibes from him, so we're not rooting for him for the romance from the very beginning. And I should be clear too here in terms of pacing, this is a self-contained romance book, which makes sense out of Avon. I'm very interested in how a lot of these romanticities are being framed in terms of pacing, and that's why I think this will be a large part of the conversation. But we have a very centralized romance here in the sense that we get the entire romance for our leads here from beginning to end within the course of this book, for better and worse at times. And so romance really is the main driver here, even if the fantasy is a little bit more forward than you might see in some other fantasy romance, though I do need to swing back and read a lot more fantasy romance kind of from the traditional school, which I also enjoy as well. But also in terms of pacing, and I do not mean this as a derogatory, because I have historically really loved young adult fiction, right? But I think we are actually seeing this kind of boom in romantasy because it's taking a lot of the things that readers that grew up reading young adult of the like mid 2000s through the mid 2010s especially loved, and kind of aging them up as those readers have aged up. And part of that appeal, I would argue, is the really fast pacing and again, the kind of focus or kind of centering of those romantic elements. Now, I do think that there is a give and take there. And here I think that's kind of evident in the voice as well. It's very interesting because we clearly have this fantastical world, and a fantastical world, according to the acknowledgments, that is inspired by the author's Indian, Middle Eastern, and Caribbean roots. So we really have this vibrant, robust world, which I honestly would have loved to see get built out more. We had the kind of archetypes here, which I do think work when we are thinking of like romantasy as a genre, because the archetypes translate well to romance where we have these kind of familiar tropes, and so hitting some of these familiar narrative beats is almost more satisfying rather than feeling reductive, or there's no worry about kind of falling into predictability if the moment is earned because there is something satisfying about that moment. For instance, there is a reversal of identity that honestly, I don't know how much of a reversal it is at the end, or even going back to our love interest before like some of the reversals at the end, the fact that he actually is the half-brother of the prince. So he is essentially the bastard prince. And that is a very satisfying and expected, honestly, reveal. But if it hadn't been there, I would have wanted some explanation, right? Like, what is the reveal that makes up for that not being the thing? And also we fall into some of these chosen one tropes, right? Where Soraya is brought to the capital, but there's more going on. This isn't just a hunt for a bride, it's actually also a hunt for someone with very particular magical powers rooted in myth and legend. And is that Soraya? Spoiler alert, yes, of course it is. And so you have this setup that pushes Soraya and Roshan together in terms of that romance and these beats that feel familiar, and so the reader is able to make those narrative leaps a little quicker in terms of the fast-paced nature of this book. That being said, I do still think it moved very quick. And then additionally circling back to that idea of some of that young adult feeling in terms of the pacing, we also again have this first person point of view, which I also know is incredibly popular right now in romance across the board, particularly in contemporary and romantasy, but we are also seeing it kind of bleed a little bit, I would argue, into historical from some authors and some new authors as well, which is fine in the sense that, like, yes, let's experiment with the genre. Is it my personal preference? No, it's not. And so I think that that kind of contributes to the tone and the feeling of the book as well. And the voice here is very interesting because we start off with a very light tone, especially at the beginning with the banter between Soraya and her best friend. And it's also very kind of body banter at the beginning, which I think is kind of an establishing of expectation for the reader because it does feel kind of out of place. They are just like joking in a way that you would with your friends. Like, I'm not debating that, but about, crushes and what people may or may not be desiring further in intimacy and what dreams Soraya may or may not be having that do come up again, but also don't feel as present. Like, they kind of fall away. She has these very particular dreams that involve fantasies that just kind of fall to the wayside after a point, and to a point feel like a way to bring some of that intimacy and the kind of romance centered nature of things to the forefront when we are not quite there yet in the plot. And it also feels like this kind of banter at the beginning is to set this expectation of what kind of book this is going to be, and especially set out, those expectations as not only a romance, but as an adult romance where there will be intimacy. And in some ways, it's kind of this meshing of, this pacing and this tonality we're used to from young adult in this vein, but then trying to bring it up with readers. And it's interesting because I know Howard also writes historical romance, which I shamefully actually have not read yet. I do have some of those titles lined up on kind of deck as well. When I will get to them, I do not know, but you probably know I am a lover of historical romance, but I do not know what or how this compares to her tone in historical romance. If there is a difference there, if she writes in third person in historical, I'm not sure, but I definitely noted that first person in the tone here, which again, a lot of readers are really enjoying and preferring right now. However, it is only told through Soraya's point of view. And I do think that that was purposeful because there are some reveals with Roshan that happen. And so I think that was to kind of try and play that close to the chest. However, I would argue that most romantasy readers are expecting the beats that happen with Roshan to happen. And so I personally would have preferred to get a little bit more of the conflict of the dual points of view and getting to see things from his point of view as well, a little bit more of that dramatic irony, especially as we know that there are secrets being kept. We know that our lead in Soraya is not completely in the loop. And so, especially with it being so romance forward, I think that that would have helped build the tension because it doesn't really feel to me, as much as I love this relationship dynamic, I love these two characters as much as I know them, because they don't feel as deep or robust as characters as ideally I would have liked. Now, Soraya, has a little bit more action and we are in her point of view, so I do feel like I know her a little better, but to a certain extent, it is that thing where it sometimes feels like we are meeting the plot beats rather than kind of morphing those plot beats around our characters, which I think is a real unique opportunity of this form, this idea that we can play with these reversals and these tropes that we love so much in fantasy and kind of utilize them to our characters and it being character forward. It felt like this book was still really trying to beef the plot up without the plot actually being beefed up. It moved very quickly. We moved through a lot of things very quickly. It's like we were distilling an entire trilogy into one book in terms of everywhere we went. And that meant that even though the characters and the romance were the center of things, they didn't feel as deeply drawn as I think they could have been. And I think getting dual points of view would have been part of that and would have helped build that tension as well, because we did have the immediate attraction between these two, really, and they did, or we had a kind of pantomiming of them trying to ignore this attraction, but it never felt like a real obstacle. And while I did enjoy Soraya kind of taking what she wanted and being very forward about her wants and desires, I also would have liked to see more of the relationship stakes, because as much as some of the plotting kind of fell into the trap of feeling like it had to hit the beats where it hit them, the relationship felt like that 2, when instead I think we could have used this structure, like I mentioned earlier, to really beef out the character work and the relationship work and use that as the setting. If it was already going to be kind of rushed and kind of thinly drawn, and again, I don't mean that as a negative in this instance, because I like using fantastical worlds as a backdrop for these relationships, and I think that that's one of the appeals of this genre, but I think we could have utilized that better in terms of really allowing these characters more time together to get to know each other and to feel more deeply drawn and to really build out that tension so that those intimate moments, and when we get to that, it feels earned, especially because right now it feels like the physical intimacy of the book kind of happens where it's allowed, in the sense that, like, oh, there is a kind of break here in terms of they are at a place that allows them to be there physically or to get to physical intimacy, but their relationship doesn't feel like it's at the place where it allows for physical intimacy. At the same time, I don't begrudge it because it does allow for some reversals later, or heightens the stakes of some of the reversals later. But also, I don't know that we fully sit with the repercussions of that after the reversal. We are moving so quick by necessity, we don't really have time to unpack a lot of that in a way that I think would have been really satisfying. I know that Crystal at Crystal's Bookish Life has kind of been talking about this a little recently, this kind of lack of tension and kind of like lust forward romance. And I don't begrudge attraction or lust, and I am fine with intimacy at whatever point in the book it feels needed for the story. But I would also argue here that I think it could have been utilized better in terms of really heightening the emotion and making it feel weightier in terms of the narrative, because as it stood, the beats were there, right? But I wasn't emotionally engaged in terms of the character arcs and their relationships, and so it didn't feel as steamy to me as I think it could have. And I honestly do think that just getting some of his point of view would have helped with that, because there would have been a little bit more conflict there, and we would have seen two people kind of trying to fight against this attraction that really there's no reason on face value necessarily to fight against, but what exactly is going on there. And I think it would have heightened the stakes there, because even though at the end of the day we really have these kingdom-sized stakes with this book, the emotional stakes and the relationship stakes are really the center of things, and or should be the center of things here in the way that this particular book is kind of laid out to my reading experience. Again, the fantasy elements here feel a little bit more incidental in that they are drawn just enough to kind of help beef things up, but at the same time, a lot of times they do, for me, unfortunately, feel a little rushed, and I can overlook that a lot easier with a really strong central romance to guide me and to kind of focus on. And I think this has all of the makings of a central romance. I love the kind of tropes set up in the romance here. I mean, I've been eating them up, whether in young adult or fantasy, in whatever iteration, for like 2 decades now. But I also think that for me as a reader, the unique opportunity of romantasy, or romance more generally as a genre, is the central focus on that romance, but I didn't feel like the romance here felt as developed as I think it could have been, which kind of like returns us to this Goldilocks scenario, where in some of the romantasy I've been reading recently, for me personally as a reader, it feels like there's either too much superfluous world building that kind of bogs things down a little bit, or here it feels a little bit more rushed, and I don't know what that balance is. Now, I will say I did enjoy, again, that it was a contained romance and that we had the entire arc in one book, because that is kind of like one of the things about romantasy right now that is a little confusing, right, for long-term romance readers, because we are used to the convention of having things wrapped up in one book. But at the same time, I do think that there were opportunities in this book to let certain things breathe a little bit more. Never mind the fact that there was or were occasional blips of an additional point of view that seemed, to my understanding, to be setting up a future book that I cannot find listed yet. So that's interesting. I will also say, back to like kind of the central setup of the book, and they start with this kind of challenge element, right, between all of these young women, and one, or the first challenge, is they are given a riddle in order to be able to eat dinner. And I joked that I like to consider myself a reasonably intelligent person. I hope that nigh on 5 years of sitting down and digging into books with you all is evidence of that. However, the minute you throw a riddle in front of me, I'm like, guess I'm gonna die. I surely don't know. But we do have those elements that are really satisfying for a lot of readers. That initial challenge, the reversal, the discovery of hidden powers, the corrupt system, and getting in league with the rebels. Though Soraya is awfully mistrustful of the rebels for a long time in the book, even after the prince tries to do her bodily harm in a way that I was like, maybe you would be rethinking the framing of everything at this point. But that's just me. I can't put myself in those shoes, nor do I really want to, I guess. But if you were looking for a new romantasy and one that seems to err on the side of romance conventions, I think that this would definitely be a potential read for you. For me, I had a good time, but at the same time, I do think it moved a little quick for me, and the tone was a little off in terms of I think we could have had some more of that tension, and some of it felt a little juvenile at times. I believe Soraya, based on the text and a reference, was supposed to be 25, but she didn't feel 25 to me. I don't know. I would be very interested if you've read this book to hear your thoughts. I definitely think it's still worth checking out, especially if you are a fan of romantasy. And if you are a fan of romantasy, I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts within those contexts as well, as you are probably a little bit more attuned to the specific genre conventions of romantasy that I am still getting used to, even as someone who has read in both genres for a long time. So with that, let me know what you're thinking. Thank you as always for being interested in what I'm thinking. As mentioned before, go ahead and like, go ahead and subscribe. Most importantly, read something good. And yeah, bye.